The cabin had stood empty through 2 winters, and it showed. The roof had gone in at the north corner where a ridgepole cracked, and the snow had come through after that and finished the work. The door hung on one hinge, swung partway open, and had swung that way long enough that the grass beneath it grew in a curve. The chimney was river stone, laid up by somebody in a hurry, and it had split from the flashing to the ground. Around all of it, the wild rye stood waist-high, right up to the porch boards and through them. Sarah Reed stood at the edge of what had been a yard and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Wes Tanner had already looked at it. He had ridden up here 7 days ago, alone, and walked the fence line, and gone inside, and come out again. He had known then what she was seeing now. He had paid for it anyway. Inside, the floor was scorched black in a circle 4 feet across, well away from the hearth. Whoever had lived here last had given up on the chimney at some point and built his fires on the planks instead, and had gone on doing it long enough to burn through in 2 places. That told most of the story. A man does not do that in his first year. Sarah crouched and put her hand flat on the burned wood. Then she stood and looked at the smoke-dark ceiling and the gap of white sky at the north corner, and she counted forward in her head to the first hard frost. 6 weeks, maybe 7. Wes took a folded paper from his shirt pocket and held it out to her. It was a receipt, written in pencil, in a hand that sloped badly. $20, cabin and what is left of the fence. Nothing about the land. The land still belonged to the government. Keeping it would cost them 5 years. Wes Tanner had come to the Reed place when he was 12 years old, and he had come in the back of a wagon. His father and mother had worked for Amos Reed for 9 years by then, and for other men before that, and none of it had ever come to land. That was the whole of what they left him. In the spring of 1869, they drove into town for flour and nails and did not come back. And the ford on the Grand Ronde was running 4 feet over its summer bed. And it was Amos Reed who rode out and found them and brought them home. He kept the boy. There was no paper drawn up and no arrangement made in town. Amos Reed simply did not send him anywhere, and after a while, nobody asked. Wes worked. He was 12, and there was no talk of school for him, because there was no talk of school for any hand on that place. Sarah Reed was 9, and she went. And in the evenings, she brought her copybook out to the bunkhouse steps and made him write his letters in the margins where she had left room. She was a patient teacher and a merciless one. He could read by the time he was 14. He never told her father. At 18, he went on wages, $22 a month, and he stayed on those wages 8 years. He had $180 saved out of it, which was 8 years less a horse, a saddle, and what a man cannot help spending. Sarah kept the books. She had kept them since she was 17. The tally of stock, the freight bills, the note of what was owed and to whom, and she had never been paid $1 for any of it, because she was a daughter in the house, and daughters were not paid. The hired man was paid. She was fed. In August of 1883, Amos Reed told her she would marry the Vestal boy from the place east of his, and that the 2 outfits would run as one, and that the matter was settled. Then he told her what would happen if it was not settled. He said it once, and he did not raise his voice, because her father had never in his life said a thing twice. Wes was gone by the next morning. They had perhaps 4 minutes at the corral gate to arrange the rest of their lives. 1 week, he said. Be ready. What he did with the week was ride. A man in LeGrand told him about a quarter section up against the timber that a Missouri family had filed on and quit after 2 winters. $20 bought the cabin and the fence from the man who had walked away from both. The land he filed on at the land office on the 6th day, $10 and 2 more in commission, and swore he was 26 years old and a citizen of the United States, which he was. On the 7th day he came for her. They were married that afternoon in the front room of a justice of the peace in LeGrand, with the man's wife standing up as the only witness, and drove east toward the mountains in a second-hand wagon behind a mule named Pat, carrying a plow, a barrel of flour, 40 pounds of seed potatoes, and $58. Amos Reed did not come after them. He never wrote. That was the whole of it, and it was worse than being followed. They had 6 weeks, and they did not agree on how to spend them. Wes wanted the well. There was a spring seep 400 yards down the draw, and it ran clear. But 400 yards is a long way with 2 buckets, and it would be longer under snow. Sarah sat on the wagon tongue on their second evening with a stub of pencil in the back of a freight bill and worked it out. Roof, chinking, chimney, and enough wood cut and split to burn from November to March. She wrote the days each one would take, and she added them and showed him the number. There was no room in it for a well. He dug anyway. He picked a spot below the cabin where the ground stayed dark, and he went down 11 days and came up with dry gravel at 19 feet. And then the sides began to slough, and he quit. Neither of them said anything about it. But after that, he asked her first. The roof took the rest of September. He felled a straight pine and bucked it into 2-foot blocks and split shakes off them with a froe and a wooden mallet, and Sarah carried them up the ladder 1 armload at a time. They laid them from the eave up, each course over the joint of the one below, and the north corner, where the ridgepole had cracked, he sistered with a new pole, cut green, and dragged up by the mule. Green wood in a roof is a poor way to build. It would season and shrink and open the joints, and he would be up there again in 2 years. He did it anyway, because it was the 29th of September. Then the chinking. The gaps between the logs were wide as a man's hand in places, and the old mud had fallen out years before. They mixed clay from the creek bank with cut grass and pressed it in by hand, working from inside and outside both, and it took 9 days, and both their hands cracked and split and bled at the knuckles and did not heal until spring. The chimney nearly beat them. He took it down to the hearthstone and laid it up again in river rock and clay mortar, and they built a fire in it on the 20th of October, and the room filled with smoke inside of a minute. They put it out and opened the door and stood in the yard coughing. He looked at it for 2 days. Then he took the top 4 feet down and built it back up 6, and narrowed the throat above the fireplace with 2 flat stones set on edge, and lit it again, and the smoke went up. Sarah wrote the date on the freight bill. It was the first thing she ever wrote down in that house. The wood was where his years on the Reed place paid. Green pine will not burn. It hisses and smokes and lines a chimney with tar, and a man who fills his shed with it in October will be burning his furniture in February. What Wes wanted was standing dead, pine that had died on the stump and dried upright in the wind, 3 years dead or better, that rang when you struck it. He could find it walking. He had been finding it since he was 13. They cut 11 cords between the middle of October and the first heavy snow. He felled and bucked and she stacked, and the stack ran along the south wall of the cabin and stood higher than the window, and she measured it and wrote the figure down. It was the only thing that year they have enough of. The snow came on the 8th of November and did not leave. The seep froze in the 3rd week. He broke it open with an axe every morning for a while, and then it froze deeper than he could break, and after that they melted snow. Nobody tells you what that costs. Snow is mostly air. It takes something near 10 kettles of it packed down to make 1 kettle of water, and every one of those kettles is wood, and the wood was 11 cords, and the winter was 4 months. Sarah kept the fire low and the pot on it and fed snow into it all day long, and in the evening she wrote down how much wood had gone and how much stood, and divided. That was how the ledger started, not as a business, as a count of days. She started another column beside it in December. Flour, beans, potatoes, salt pork, and the venison Wes shot in the last week of November, and they hung frozen in the lean-to and cut off of with a saw. She wrote what they used each week, and she carried the number forward, and every Sunday she knew exactly how far into March they could go. In the 2nd week of February, the number stopped reaching March. She did not tell him for 2 days. Then she told him, and he took the mule and went down to Cold Spring and came back with 100 pounds of flour and beans on credit against a man he had never met, and the man's name was Gideon Hurst. And that was the first time either of them heard it. They ate light, and they burned light, and they got through. There was nothing in those 4 months to tell. That is the truth of it. They were cold, and they were bored, and they were often afraid. And Sarah read the same 2 books 11 times, and Wes mended harness he had already mended. And neither of them said out loud that the potatoes would not last, because both of them had seen the column. The thaw came in the last week of March. On the 9th of April he started the second well, 40 yards uphill of the first, where a line of willow scrub came out of the slope in a way he had been looking at all winter. He went down 23 feet in 9 days, cribbing the sides with split poles as he went, and at 23 feet the gravel came up wet, and at 24 the hole began to fill. He came up on the rope black to the elbows and did not say anything, and Sarah did not either. She went inside and got the freight bill and wrote it down. The stumps were the whole year. There were between 40 and 50 of them on the flat below the cabin where the Missouri family had cut their house logs and their fence rails and then given up. And every one of them was ponderosa pine 2 to 3 feet through, with a taproot going down into the ground like a man's arm into a sleeve. Powder would have taken them out in a morning. Powder cost money they did not have, and a charge in a stump can be heard 6 miles on a still day. And Wes had a reason of his own for not wanting to be heard that year. He never said the reason, and Sarah never asked him about it. So they burned him. The method was old, and it was slow, and any man who has done it hates it. You bore a hole down into the heart of the stump with an auger, and another in from the side to meet it, and you set a fire of pitchwood in the bottom, and the draft between the 2 holes makes a chimney of the stump, and it burns from the inside out. It smolders for 2 days and 3 nights. It does not flame. It sits there in the ground and eats itself, and makes a smell that gets into clothing and does not wash out. Then it is still there. It is only lighter. That was the part nobody told them. After the burn, you still had to break the crown loose with a mattock and cut the lateral roots with an axe, working on your knees in a hole, and then set the chain and bring the mule up against it. Pat weighed 1,200 pounds and pulled better than a horse and had more sense, and even so, the first 4 stumps took 3 days apiece. By the middle of May, they had it down to 2 days. By July, with a second chain and a snatch block anchored to a standing tree, they could sometimes do one in a day and a half. Sarah worked the burns. She learned to read the smoke. White meant it had found damp and would go out. Blue-gray meant it was eating, and none at all meant it was done or dead, and you had to go look. She kept 4 stumps going at once in a row across the flat, walking the line at dawn, and again at noon, and again after supper, with a bucket of pitch chips. And it looked from the timber's edge like a place where something had been shelled. They stopped counting days in June and started counting stumps. She wrote them down. 22 by the 1st of July, 31 by the 1st of August. The land under the stumps was better than they had any right to expect. Pine duff, a foot deep in places, black and loose, 40 years of needles rotted down. Wes broke 4 acres of it in August with a used walking plow they had hauled from the reeds, and the sod turned over clean and dark, and Sarah stood at the end of the furrow with her hands on her hips looking at it. They put in winter wheat the first week of September, 4 acres, broadcast by hand and harrowed in with a brush drag because they had no drill. That was the year. Stumps from April to August, wheat in September, and the wood cut in October the way they had learned to do it. And this time, the well was already there and did not have to be melted. The wheat came up and it grew, and in July of 1885, they cut it with a cradle scythe and threshed it on a canvas with flails, and it made 81 bushels. It was a good yield. Sarah worked the figure 3 times because she did not believe it the first time. 81 bushels of wheat will feed 2 people and a mule for a year with something over. Hauled to Cold Spring in the fall of 1885, the something over was worth about $9, because everybody within 60 miles who had 4 acres also had wheat, and the mill paid what the mill paid, and freight to the railroad ate what was left. $9. Wes stood in the mill yard and read the ticket twice and then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket the way he had once put a receipt for $20. They had not failed. That was the thing about it. Nothing had died, nothing had frozen, no hail had come. They had done everything right and done it hard for 2 years, and at the end of it, a man in a mill yard had handed them $9. Sarah did not say anything on the road home. She was doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic did not work, and she went at it from every side she knew. 4 acres was not enough. That was the obvious answer, and it was wrong. And she knew it was wrong before they reached the creek crossing. 40 stumps had cost them a year. 16 acres would cost them 4 more. And at the end of 4 more years, the mill would still pay what the mill paid. And every other man on the mountain would still have wheat. It was not the acres, it was the wheat. She turned that over for the rest of the ride, and all of that week, and she could not get behind it, because she did not yet know what else the ground could be made to do. But she had the shape of the question now, and she wrote it in the back of the ledger where the wheat account ended, in 4 words with no figures after them. What does nobody grow? Gideon Hurst was paid back in October of 1884, 8 months after the flour, in cash and in full, and he had not asked for it. He ran 200 head and a hay meadow on the creek 4 miles below them, and he was 60 years old and had buried a wife. When Wes counted the money into his hand at the door, he looked at it and then at Wes and said that most men would have made it 2 years, and some would have made it never. And Wes said that most men had not been that hungry. That was the entire conversation. It was the longest one they had for another year. But in June of 1885, Hurst's mowing machine threw a pitman rod in the middle of first cutting, with rain coming, and the nearest man who could forge one was in LeGrand, 2 days there and back. Wes was there in an hour, with a hammer and the rod off their own broken hay rake, which did not fit, and made it fit by 4 o'clock. Hurst got his hay up dry. He offered pay. Wes would not take it. Hurst did not offer twice, because he was not a man who repeated himself either. But he stood there a moment, working something out, and then he said that if they were ever short of pasture, they could run stock on his lower meadow, and went back to his hay. Neither of them had stock. Sarah wrote the offer in the ledger anyway, on the page where she kept things that were not money. The rest of that summer she asked questions. She went to Cold Spring on Saturdays when there was nothing to sell, and stood in Mercer's store with a list she did not need, and listened. She was not good at it at first. She was a woman asking a storekeeper what freight cost and what the mill paid and who was buying, and the first 3 times Mercer answered her the way a man answers a woman who has wandered into the wrong conversation. The 4th time she brought the ledger and showed in the wheat account, and after that he answered her properly. Because Mercer had been in business 20 years and could tell the difference between curiosity and arithmetic. What she learned that summer was this. There were 4 logging camps in the Blues above them, and they ran between them something over 90 head of horses. And horses that skid logs work all winter and eat all winter and cannot be turned out on grass because there is no grass under 4 feet of snow. Every ton of hay those camps burned came up from the Grand Ronde Valley by freight wagon, 26 miles, and it cost the camps between $14 and $18 a ton delivered, and better than half of that was hauling. Their place was 7 miles from the nearest of the 4 camps, uphill for the wagon going empty, downhill loaded. And the ground under the timber was pine duff a foot deep, which will not make good wheat, and never would, and which grows timothy and clover the way a river grows willow. She did not tell Wes the day she worked it out. She wanted to check it, and it took her until August to check it, and by then she had another reason to wait. May Tanner was born in the cabin on the 4th of November, 1885, with Gideon Hurst's married daughter from the lower place attending, who had come up on the second day and stayed on the third. She was small, and she was loud, and she came 3 weeks earlier than Sarah had counted, which was the only figure Sarah got wrong that whole year. Wes was outside for 11 hours. When he came in, he stood at the foot of the bed with his hat still on, and did not seem to know what to do with his hands, and Sarah said his name once, and he took the hat off. The Hurst daughter went home on the 5th day and would not take anything for it. 2 weeks later, a crate came up on Hurst's wagon with a cradle in it that his wife had used, and his daughter after her, and a note in a hand that had learned to write late and painfully, saying it was doing nobody any good in his barn. Sarah wrote that in the ledger too, on the page that was not money. It was the third entry on that page. It was starting to be a longer page than she had expected. That winter, she told him. She had it laid out on 4 sheets by then, what timothy seed cost, what an acre would yield in the second year and the third, what a ton was worth delivered at the camp gate against what it was worth in the valley, how many acres they could hold and cut and haul with 1 mule and a borrowed rake, and what all of it came to against the $9. Wes read it twice. He was slow at reading and always had been, and she had taught him herself on the bunkhouse steps and knew exactly how long it would take him, and she waited. He said it meant tearing out the wheat. She said it meant tearing out the wheat. He asked what happened if the camps shut. She had that on the 4th sheet. 3 of the 4 had been cutting up there 11 years, and the Camella outfit had just built a new bunkhouse, which is not a thing a man builds when he is leaving. He sat there a while with the baby asleep against his shoulder. Then he said they had better get the seed ordered before the snow, and went out to look at the mule. Timothy seed cost them $19, and it went in on the flat in the first week of April, broadcast into the wheat stubble after Wes had gone over it twice with a spring-tooth harrow borrowed from Hurst. 12 acres. He had spent February and March on the last of the stumps at the upper end, and they had got the flat out to 12, and the ground came ready faster than they expected, because 2 years of pine duff turned under had rotted into something that a man could run his hand into up to the wrist. The first year a timothy stand does very little, and that is the part of it that has to be got through. It comes up thin and low, and looks like a mistake all summer, and the wheat that would have been standing there is not standing there. They lived that year on the last of the wheat and on Wes's wages. He went out in June and worked 6 weeks haying down in the valley at $1.25 a day, and Sarah stayed on the place with a 7-month-old, and that was the longest either of them had been alone since the corral gate. He came back the 9th of August with $49 and the used mowing machine he had bought off a man near Island City for $31 of it, which was old and needed a new pitman and 1 new section knife, and which he had known how to judge because he had spent 8 years fixing exactly that machine for Amos Reed. He cut the 12 acres on the last Tuesday of August, a light crop off a young stand, and Hurst had told him not to cut it at all the first year, and Wes had cut it anyway because they needed something in the barn. That was where they made their one bad mistake with hay. It lay in the swath through a hot Wednesday, and Sarah went out Thursday morning and took a handful and twisted it, and it did not bleed, and she said it was ready. Wes said another day. She had the figures on the drying of hay from a Department of Agriculture bulletin Mercer had let her take from the store, and Wes had the smell of the air, and she was the one who had been right about the well. They raked and cocked it Thursday and hauled it in Friday. It heated in the mow. By the middle of the following week, the stack was hot enough that a man could feel it through his boots at the top, and it smelled sweet and wrong, and Wes pulled the whole of it back out into the yard in a day and a half and spread it, and lost better than a third of it and very nearly lost the barn. Hay put up damp does not merely spoil, it ferments, and it holds the heat in the middle of the stack, and it has burned down more barns in this country than lightning has. Sarah did not defend the bulletin. She got the ledger and wrote down the dates. Cut Tuesday, tested Thursday, hauled Friday. And beside them what the stack had done, And then she wrote the thing Wes had said about the air and had not been able to explain, which was that the underside of the swath had not been turned, and the ground beneath it was still cold from a wet June. After that, they turned the swath, every cutting, both sides, and they lost no more hay in 6 years. What was left when it was over was 4 tons. 4 tons of first-year Timothy in a barn on the 12th of September, 1886, and 1 load of it went up to the Camella camp at the end of the month and came back as a note in a camp clerk's hand for $16 the ton. $16 a ton. He had made $9 off 4 acres of wheat in a whole year. He set the note on the table in front of Sarah, and she looked at it. And then she got up and got the ledger and opened it to a clean page, and ruled it into 6 columns while he was still standing there with his coat on. Date, camp, tons, rate, paid, signed. She told him to have the clerk sign for every load. Wes asked what for. She said that a note in a clerk's hand is a note in a clerk's hand, and a signature is a fact. 3 tons left in the barn when the snow came, and $32 in the tin, and it was the 8th of November, and it began to snow on that day, and it did not stop. The hard winter came the January after. 38 below on Mercer's thermometer, and the valley went into it with half the hay it needed, because 4 soft years had taught everybody that stock wintered itself. Men came up the mountain all that month leading horses they could not feed, and Wes could have sold what was left in the barn for 4 times the camp rate, and nobody would have blamed him for it. He sold it at $16 the ton, the same as always, until it was gone. Sarah wrote the price he could have gotten under a ruled line in the ledger and never crossed it out. That was the winter that decided things, though nobody up there knew it yet. The open range was finished within 3 years. Men fenced, men put up hay, men did what Wes and Sarah had already been doing since 1886 without knowing it was the future. The 12 acres became 20. The 1 mule became 2. A barn went up 40 feet by 60, and Gideon Hurst sent 2 of his own hired men to help raise it and would not take $1 for their time. The ledger kept growing the way it always had: dates, tons, rates, signatures, and beside the money there was another page that was not money at all, and by 1888 it ran to 2 full sides. Samuel Fry, who took the next claim east and did not know a well from a wash tub until Wes walked his draw and showed him where to dig. Mercer, who carried them 90 days on credit once on the strength of a ledger he had read across his own counter. Hurst's name on that page 11 times in 6 years. May grew up in the middle of it, 4 years old by the fall of 1889, calling both mules Pat and unable to be kept out of the barn. That October they proved up. The notice ran 6 weeks in the paper, as the law required, and they went into LeGrand and stood before the register while Hurst and Fry swore to what they had seen with their own eyes. A house, a barn, 2 wells, 20 acres of the best Timothy in that end of the county, and 6 years of a woman and a man living exactly where they said they had. It took 40 minutes. The patent came from Washington the following spring, and Sarah put it in the tin box with the receipt for $20, and that was the whole of the ceremony there was. They went to see her parents that November on Hurst's word that Amos Reed had taken to asking after them and did not want the asking repeated. The Reed place was smaller than it had been. A section sold off, a hired man where there had once been 4. And Amos Reed came out onto his own porch and did not come down the steps until his granddaughter walked up into the yard by herself and told him her name was May Tanner, and she had 2 mules, both called Pat. Then he came down and got onto one knee in the dirt in front of her, which cost him something, and said that was a good name for a mule. Nobody spoke of the marriage that had been arranged, or the week in August of 1883, or the 4 letters that had gone unanswered. Della talked instead for 2 days, holding the child on her lap the whole time she did it. On the second morning, Amos took Wes out to the horse barn, and they were gone the better part of an hour. And when Sarah looked out the kitchen window, she saw her father's hand come to rest for a moment on a gate latch that had been crooked since the spring of 1883, and stay there, and then let it fall. And neither man said a word about it. They left after 2 days. Amos Reed walked out ahead of the wagon and held the gate open while they went through it, and was still standing in the gateway when they came over the rise. They got home after dark, the fire out, the stock wanting feeding. Later, with the room come round again, Sarah took a clean ledger out of the crate her mother had packed and wrote the date at the top of the first page. November 14th, 1889. Home. Went to my mother's and came back. Then she ruled the columns for the winter's hay.